He invited his ex-wife to watch him marry his mistress, expecting tears, regret, maybe even humiliation. But Emily Carter walked in calm, composed, like she already knew something no one else did. The whispers followed her, the subtle stares, the way a few powerful guests suddenly straightened when she passed. Ryan smirked as he raised a glass, ready to introduce her as his past, until the doors opened again and Alexander Hayes stepped in, billion-dollar silence trailing behind him, his eyes locked only on Emily, not the bride, not the groom, just her. And when he reached her, he didn't ask, he didn't hesitate. He simply took her hand and said, "It's time they know who you really are." And in that moment, the wedding stopped breathing. He invited her to watch him replace her, but he had no idea she had already replaced the entire game. The words echoed in Emily Carter's mind as she stood in the quiet glow of her apartment, the wedding invitation resting between her fingers like a relic from a life that no longer belonged to her. The thick ivory cardstock embossed with silver lettering, Ryan Brooks and Sophia Lane, a union polished to perfection, a performance designed not just to celebrate love, but to rewrite history, to erase her, to prove that she had been nothing more than a temporary chapter in a story he now claimed as his own. The city outside hummed with its usual rhythm, taxis passing, distant sirens, the soft flicker of neon against glass. But inside, everything was still, measured, deliberate. Emily placed the invitation on the marble countertop, her reflection faint in its surface. Not the woman Ryan had left behind, not the one who had once adjusted her dreams to fit inside his ambitions, but someone quieter, sharper, someone who had learned the language of silence and used it like armor. She remembered the last time he had looked at her, that dismissive half-smile, the way he had said she wasn't built for the world he wanted, that she lacked the drive, the presence, the spark, words that had once lingered like shadows but now felt distant, irrelevant, almost laughable. Her phone buzzed softly, a message from a number saved without a name, just a single line. "Everything is in place." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached for her coat, the fabric smooth and structured, a quiet statement of control, and stepped out into the evening air, the chill brushing against her skin as if to remind her she was alive, that this moment mattered. The drive to the venue stretched across miles of glowing highways, each passing light reflecting in her eyes like fragments of something rebuilding. The venue itself rose ahead like a monument to excess, towering glass, cascading lights, guests already gathering in tailored suits and flowing gowns, laughter spilling into the night like champagne. She stepped out of the car without hesitation, heels steady against the pavement. No rush, no hesitation, only intention. Inside, the air was thick with perfume and expectation. Conversations dipped as she walked past, subtle glances, quiet recognition, though none of them could quite place why she seemed different, why she didn't carry the weight they expected her to, why she looked like someone who wasn't here to be judged but to observe, to measure, to decide. Ryan hadn't seen her yet. He stood across the room, confident, composed, playing the role he had perfected, unaware that the stage beneath him was no longer his. Emily paused near the entrance, her gaze sweeping the room once, calm, calculating, and for just a second, the faintest hint of a smile touched her lips, not out of nostalgia, not out of pain, but because she knew something no one else in that room did. Tonight was never about watching him win. Tonight was about letting him believe he already had, just long enough for everything to change. The music swelled as if it had been rehearsed to perfection, a polished symphony of strings and soft percussion that wrapped the room in a sense of grandeur. But beneath it, Emily could hear something else, the subtle shift of attention, the quiet recalibration of power as conversations faltered and eyes followed her movement across the marble floor. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. Each step measured, deliberate, her posture effortless yet unyielding, as though the space itself adjusted to accommodate her presence rather than the other way around. A waiter passed offering champagne, and she accepted a glass with a faint nod, her fingers steady against the chilled crystal, the golden liquid catching the light like a promise not yet spoken. She did not drink. She simply held it, an anchor, a signal, across the room. Ryan finally noticed her, the change in his expression almost imperceptible to anyone who did not know him. But Emily saw it clearly. the flicker of surprise quickly masked by that familiar confidence. The same expression he had worn the day he told her she would never belong in his world. He leaned slightly towards Sophia, murmuring something that made her glance over, her lips curling into a smile that was too precise to be genuine, too practiced to be spontaneous. Together they began to move, cutting through the crowd with the ease of people accustomed to being watched, to being admired, to being believed. Emily remained where she was, unshaken, her gaze calm, as if she were observing a scene she had already seen before, as if none of this held the power it once did. The distance between them closed and Ryan stopped just short of her, his presence familiar in a way that felt distant, like a memory fading at the edges. "Emily," he said, his voice smooth, measured, carrying just enough volume for those nearby to hear, to turn, to listen. "I did not expect you to come." The words were framed as politeness but carried the unmistakable edge of performance. She met his eyes without flinching, without offering him the reaction he was searching for. "You sent an invitation," she replied, her tone even, unhurried. It would have been rude not to respond. A subtle shift moved through the small circle forming around them, a few guests pausing mid-conversation, sensing the tension wrapped in civility. Sophia stepped forward then, her presence sharp and deliberate, her hand resting lightly on Ryan's arm as if to reinforce her position. "We just wanted to make sure there were no hard feelings," she said, her voice light, but calculated, each word placed carefully. Emily's gaze moved to her briefly, not with hostility, not with resentment, but with a quiet assessment that seemed to strip away the layers of performance. "Of course," Emily said softly. "Why would there be?" The simplicity of her answer landed heavier than any accusation could have, leaving a space where something sharper might have been expected. Ryan gave a short laugh, the sound slightly too loud, slightly too forced. "Well, I am glad you are here," he added, lifting his glass as if to seal the moment, to claim control of it, to frame her presence as something he had orchestrated, something that validated his version of events. But Emily did not raise her glass in return. She simply watched him, the silence stretching just long enough to make him shift, to make Sophia's smile tighten at the edges. Somewhere behind them a voice called Ryan's name, pulling him away, offering him an escape he took without hesitation. And as they turned, as the crowd slowly resumed its rhythm, Emily exhaled quietly, not from relief, but from certainty. Because the room had begun to change, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the subtle ways that mattered. The way a few key figures now looked at her with recognition instead of curiosity. The way the air seemed to hold a question no one had yet voiced. And as she stood there, untouched by the spectacle unfolding around her, one truth settled clearly into place. They still believed this was his stage. And that was exactly what made it work. The ceremony was about to begin when the room shifted. Again, not with noise but with presence, the kind that did not need to announce itself. The kind that made conversations pause mid-sentence and glasses hover in the air. Emily felt it before she saw him. The subtle ripple moving through the crowd. The quiet urgency in the way a few of the most influential guests straightened, adjusted their posture, recalibrated their attention, and then the doors opened. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough for a man to step through as if he had always belonged there. Alexander Hayes did not rush. He did not scan the room for approval. He walked with a calm certainty that seemed to bend the space around him, his tailored suit dark against the soft glow of the chandeliers, his presence defined not by excess but by restraint. And yet everyone knew exactly who he was. The conversations that followed were hushed, almost reverent, as his name passed quietly from one guest to another. Ryan turned, confusion flickering across his face as he tried to place the unexpected interruption into his carefully constructed narrative. This was not part of the plan, not part of the script he believed he controlled. Sophia's grip on his arm tightened slightly, her smile faltering just enough to reveal uncertainty beneath the surface. But Emily did not move. She did not react. She simply watched as Alexander crossed the room, his path direct, unwavering, until he stopped in front of her, the distance between them dissolving into something that felt inevitable rather than surprising. For a moment the world seemed to narrow, the noise fading into a distant hum, all attention drawn to a single point that no one could ignore. Alexander's gaze met hers, steady, familiar, as if this moment had been decided long before any invitation was sent, long before any assumption was made, and then he spoke, his voice low but carrying effortlessly through the silence that had settled over the room. I was beginning to think you would let them finish without you. The words were not a question, not a request, but a quiet acknowledgement of something already understood. Emily's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, not in triumph, but in recognition. I wanted to see how far he would go, she replied, her tone calm, almost reflective, as if the evening had been an observation rather than a confrontation. A subtle murmur spread through the nearby guests, confusion giving way to curiosity, curiosity shifting into realization, because this was not the dynamic they expected. This was not a rescue, not a coincidence. This was something else entirely, something that had been unfolding beneath the surface while everyone else watched the obvious story play out. Alexander extended his hand, not dramatically, not for effect, simply as a continuation of what had already begun. Then it is time, he said quietly, and for the first time Ryan stepped forward, his voice cutting through the moment with an edge that betrayed the control he was losing. Time for what? He asked, his tone sharper now, less composed, the confidence cracking just enough to reveal uncertainty beneath it. Alexander did not look at him, not immediately. His focus remained on Emily, as if the answer did not require permission, did not require validation, and when he finally turned, his gaze settled on Ryan. With a calm that felt heavier than confrontation, for the truth to catch up, he said simply, the words landing with a weight that silenced whatever response Ryan had prepared. And in that moment, as the room held its breath, as the illusion of control began to unravel in ways no one could yet fully see, one thing became undeniable. Emily had never been standing on his stage, she had been standing just outside it, waiting for the right moment to reveal that it had never belonged to him at all. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt heavy, deliberate, as if the room itself was waiting to understand what had just shifted. Ryan let out a short breath that almost resembled a laugh, but it lacked conviction, lacked the effortless control he had carried all evening. You are going to have to explain that, he said, his voice tighter now, the smooth confidence replaced with something more brittle, something uncertain. Alexander finally turned fully toward him, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. I would have thought you already knew, he replied, not with arrogance, but with quiet clarity, as though the answer had always been within reach, just ignored. Sophia stepped forward then, her composure returning in practiced layers. I think there has been some kind of misunderstanding, she said, her tone light but edged, her eyes flicking between them, as if trying to regain control of a narrative slipping through her fingers. But Emily did not look at her. She did not need to. Her attention remained steady, anchored, as though everything that mattered had already been decided. A man from across the room approached quickly, one of the senior partners from a well-known investment firm, his expression no longer casual but intent. Miss Carter, he said, his voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of those closest. We have been waiting for your confirmation. The words landed like a quiet disruption, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Ryan's gaze snapped back to Emily, confusion sharpening into something closer to disbelief. Confirmation for what? He asked, the question slipping out before he could reshape it into something more controlled. Emily finally shifted her stance, not retreating, not advancing, simply aligning herself with the moment as it unfolded. The acquisition, she said, her voice calm, steady, the simplicity of her tone making the meaning settle more deeply than any dramatic declaration could have. A ripple moved through the crowd, the kind that did not need volume to spread, just recognition, realization, the slow recalibration of understanding. Sophia's fingers tightened against Ryan's arm, her smile faltering completely now. That is not possible, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else, because it contradicted everything she believed about the evening, about the roles they had assigned, about who was supposed to stand where. Alexander glanced briefly at the man who had spoken, giving a small nod that felt less like approval and more like confirmation of what had already been set in motion. Everything has been prepared, he said, his tone even, It only needed her decision. The implications settled with unmistakable clarity. This was not coincidence, not interruption. This was alignment. Emily looked toward Ryan then, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a composed stillness that held far more weight than either could have. "You built this event to prove something," she said quietly. "But you never realized what it actually was." Ryan shook his head slightly, as if rejecting the reality forming in front of him. "You are not serious," he said, but the certainty in his voice was gone, replaced by something searching, something grasping. Emily did not answer immediately. She let the silence stretch just enough for the room to lean into it, for every eye to remain fixed on her, for every assumption to hang suspended. And then she turned back to the man waiting beside her, her decision already made long before this moment. "Go ahead," she said simply, and in that instant, as the weight of her words settled across the room, one truth became undeniable. She had not come to witness an ending. She had come to begin something that would rewrite everything they thought they understood. The moment her words settled, the man beside her stepped forward with quiet precision, unfolding a slim leather folder that seemed almost insignificant compared to the weight it carried. But the room felt it instantly, the shift from spectacle to consequence, from illusion to reality. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but firm enough to draw every lingering whisper into silence. "We will proceed with the announcement as scheduled." Ryan's hand tightened around his glass, the faint clink betraying the tension he could no longer mask. "Scheduled," he repeated, the word unfamiliar in a moment he believed he controlled. Sophia glanced at him, her expression searching for reassurance that was no longer there. But Emily did not look at either of them. Her attention remained forward, steady, as though this had always been the direction she was moving toward. The man opened the folder, the soft rustle of paper cutting through the stillness. "Effective immediately," he continued. "The controlling interest of Brooks Holdings has been transferred under a private acquisition led by Carter Strategic Group." The name landed with quiet force, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. A few guests exchanged quick glances, recognition flashing across their faces as pieces began to connect. Ryan's expression froze, the color draining just enough to reveal the fracture beneath his composure. "That is not possible," he said again. But this time the words lacked resistance, lacked structure, as though he was trying to argue with something already decided. Emily finally turned toward him, not sharply, not abruptly, but with a calm that made the movement feel final. "You were so focused on proving I did not belong," she said, her voice low yet clear enough to carry. "You never asked who I had become." The simplicity of her words cut deeper than accusation, because they did not need to convince. They only needed to exist. Sophia's posture shifted, her confidence unraveling. In small, visible ways, the certainty she had worn all evening dissolving into something uncertain, something fragile. "Ryan," she whispered, but there was no answer to give, no narrative left to control. Alexander stepped slightly closer to Emily, not possessive, not protective, but aligned, his presence reinforcing what was already unfolding rather than altering it. "The transition will be seamless," he added, his tone even. "All existing operations will continue under her direction." A murmur spread through the room again, but this time it carried something different, not curiosity, not gossip, but acknowledgement, respect forming in the spaces where doubt had existed only moments before. Ryan looked at Emily as if seeing her for the first time, not as the woman he had dismissed, not as the past he believed he had outgrown, but as something he had never fully understood. "You planned this," he said quietly, the realization settling too late to change anything. Emily held his gaze for a moment, not to challenge him, not to prove anything, but simply to let the truth stand without distortion. "No," she replied, her voice steady. "I prepared." The distinction hung between them, subtle but absolute, because planning implied reaction, while preparation meant transformation, and in that difference lay everything he had failed to see, everything he had underestimated, everything he could no longer reach. The music had stopped entirely now, the ceremony forgotten, the attention of every guest anchored to a reality that had rewritten itself in front of them. And as Emily turned away, not in haste, not in triumph, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already moved beyond the moment. One final truth settled over the room. She had never come back to take anything from him. She had come back because she no longer needed anything at all. The room did not erupt. It did not collapse into chaos the way lesser moments might have. Instead, it settled into something far more powerful, a quiet recalibration where every guest began to reposition not their bodies but their understanding. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, but they were no longer about the wedding, no longer about Ryan and Sophia. They were about her, about Emily Carter, about the woman who had walked in alone and now stood at the center of something far greater than anyone had anticipated. Ryan remained still for a moment longer, as if movement itself would confirm what he was not ready to accept, his eyes following her as she turned away. The distance between them no longer measured in feet, but in everything he had failed to see, everything he had dismissed too quickly. Sophia shifted beside him, her composure cracking in subtle but unmistakable ways. "You said she had nothing," she murmured, her voice low, edged with disbelief rather than accusation. But Ryan did not answer, because there was no answer that could restore the certainty he had built his world on. Across the room, Emily moved with the same calm precision, no urgency, no hesitation, only direction. A few guests approached her now, not cautiously but with intention, their expressions respectful, their tone measured, as though they understood they were speaking to someone who no longer needed validation but commanded it effortlessly. "Miss Carter," one of them said, extending a hand. "We should discuss the transition timeline." She acknowledged him with a slight nod, her attention focused, her presence grounded in something that felt immovable. Alexander remained just beside her, not leading, not overshadowing, but aligned, his presence a quiet confirmation rather than a source of authority. "There is no rush," Emily said evenly. "Everything will proceed as planned." Her words carried the same quiet certainty that had defined her all evening, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to challenge. A server passed again, offering champagne. And this time she set her untouched glass aside without looking at it, as if she no longer needed anything to steady her, as if the moment itself had already settled into place. Near the altar, the ceremony coordinator stood uncertain, her carefully arranged timeline unraveling in ways she could not correct. The music had not resumed, the guests no longer facing forward. The entire structure of the evening shifting around a center that had nothing to do with the vows that were supposed to be exchanged. Ryan finally moved then, taking a step forward as if to reclaim something slipping beyond his reach. "Emily," he called, his voice no longer smooth, no longer controlled. But she did not stop. She did not turn immediately. And that pause, that single moment where she chose not to respond, carried more weight than any words could have. When she did turn, it was not with urgency, not with emotion, but with clarity. "Yes," she said simply, her tone neutral, giving him nothing to hold on to. He hesitated, the words he had relied on for years no longer fitting, no longer effective. "This is not how this was supposed to go," he said, and the statement hung there, not as a challenge but as a confession. Emily regarded him for a brief second, her expression unreadable but not unkind, just distant, just resolved. "No," she replied softly, "it is not." And in that quiet agreement lay the final shift, because for the first time he was not correcting her, not dismissing her, not redefining her reality to fit his own. He was simply standing in it. And as she turned away again, continuing forward without looking back, the realization settled fully, not just for him but for everyone watching. She had not interrupted his moment. She had replaced it entirely. And there was nothing left for him to do but witness it. The night did not end when the announcement settled. It expanded, stretching beyond the carefully curated timeline of the ceremony into something far less predictable and far more revealing. Clusters of guests shifted their attention completely, forming quiet circles of conversation that revolved not around vows or celebration but around strategy, implications, and the unmistakable rise of someone they had all underestimated. Emily stood near the far end of the ballroom now, the towering windows behind her reflecting the city lights like a second skyline, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, as though she had stepped into a role that had always belonged to her, not claimed it, but simply revealed it. A senior executive approached with a tablet in hand, his tone respectful, almost deferential. "We will need your confirmation on the board restructuring," he said, careful with every word, aware of the weight they now carried. Emily glanced briefly at the screen, not hurried, not overwhelmed, her eyes scanning with a familiarity that suggested this was not new territory, but a continuation of something already in motion. "Send me the updated projections by morning," she replied evenly. "I want to review everything before finalizing." Her voice held no hesitation, no uncertainty, just direction, the kind that did not need to assert itself loudly to be followed. Alexander watched her for a moment, a subtle shift in his expression, not surprise, not admiration, but recognition, as though he was witnessing the confirmation of something he had already known. "You were ready long before tonight," he said quietly, his words meant only for her. Emily allowed herself the faintest exhale, not relief but acknowledgement. "I had to be," she answered, her gaze moving briefly across the room where Ryan still stood near the altar, no longer the center of attention, no longer the axis the evening revolved around, just a man standing in a moment that had moved on without him. "He taught me that," she added, not with bitterness but with clarity, because the past had not broken her. It had refined her. Across the room Ryan's shoulders had lowered, the rigid confidence replaced by something heavier, something quieter. He watched as one guest after another redirected their attention away from him, away from the ceremony that no longer held meaning, toward the woman he had once dismissed as irrelevant. Sophia stood beside him, but no longer anchored to him, her posture uncertain, her gaze shifting as she tried to understand how quickly certainty could dissolve. "We should still proceed," she said, her voice softer now, less assured. But Ryan did not respond, because even he could feel it. The ceremony had already ended before it began, not through disruption but through irrelevance. Emily turned back toward the window, the reflection of the room behind her now a different landscape, the lights the same, the people the same, but the power unmistakably shifted. She rested her fingertips lightly against the cool glass, grounding herself not in the moment but in what came next, because this had never been the destination, only the reveal, only the point where everything hidden became visible. Alexander stepped beside her, his presence quiet but aligned. "They will talk about this for years," he said, not as a question but as an observation. Emily's reflection met his in the glass, her expression calm, almost distant. "Let them," she replied, her voice soft but unwavering. "They are only seeing the ending." And she paused just long enough for the meaning to settle, for the truth to exist without explanation. "They have no idea where it actually began." And in that quiet statement, something deeper emerged, something beyond the night, beyond the room, beyond the man who had once believed he defined her story, because what unfolded here was never about proving him wrong. It was about proving she had already moved beyond the need to be seen by him at all. The night stretched on, but its purpose had already shifted, no longer anchored to a ceremony that now felt like an afterthought. The ballroom transformed into something quieter, yet far more intense, a space where decisions were being reconsidered in real time, where alliances adjusted subtly with each exchanged glance. Emily moved through it without effort, not weaving between people but allowing them to part naturally, conversations pausing just long enough to acknowledge her presence before continuing in lower, more careful tones. There was no spectacle in the way she carried herself, no deliberate display of authority, and yet it followed her unmistakably, a current beneath the surface that everyone could feel, but no one dared to interrupt. Near one of the long marble tables a group of executives lowered their voices as she approached, their earlier confidence replaced with something more measured. "We were not aware the acquisition had progressed this far," one of them admitted, his tone respectful, stripped of assumption. Emily regarded him briefly, her gaze steady but not unkind. "That was intentional," she replied, not as an explanation but as a statement of fact. The man nodded once, understanding without needing further detail, because the message was clear. This had never been about visibility, it had been about timing. Across the room Ryan finally stepped away from the altar, the space behind him empty. Now, the decorations still immaculate but devoid of meaning. He moved slowly, as if recalibrating each step, his focus fixed on her with a persistence that no longer carried control, but something closer to realization. Sophia did not follow immediately. She remained where she was, her posture uncertain, her gaze drifting as though searching for a version of the evening that no longer existed. Emily felt Ryan's presence before he spoke, the shift in the air enough to signal his approach. "You could have told me," he said when he reached her, his voice lower now, stripped of performance. Almost searching, she turned to face him fully, her expression calm, unguarded but distant. "Would you have listened?" she asked, not sharply, not accusingly, but with a quiet honesty that left no room for deflection. He hesitated, the answer forming and dissolving in the same moment, because both of them knew the truth. The past had never been a place where her voice was heard. "I would have tried," he said finally, but even he seemed unsure of the claim. Emily held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, not dismissing him, just acknowledging what could not be rewritten. "That is the difference," she said softly. "I did not need you to try." The words settled between them, not as a weapon but as a boundary, clear and unmovable. Alexander remained nearby, not interrupting, not inserting himself, his presence a quiet constant that did not demand attention but anchored the moment nonetheless. Ryan exhaled slowly, the weight of everything pressing in, not from what she had done, but from what he had failed to see, failed to understand. "So this is it," he said, the question barely forming. Emily's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened, not with regret, not with longing, but with closure. "No," she replied, her voice steady. "This is just where you finally see it." And as the words lingered, as the distance between them became something permanent rather than temporary, the truth unfolded fully. This was never about revenge, never about proving him wrong in the way he expected. It was about stepping into a life where his perception no longer defined her reality. And as she turned away once more, not to escape, but to continue forward, one thing became undeniable. The past had not followed her into this room. It had remained exactly where it belonged, behind her, untouched and irrelevant. The air in the ballroom no longer carried anticipation, it carried consequence, a quiet awareness that something irreversible had already taken place, the kind of shift that did not need to be announced because everyone could feel it settling into place. Emily moved toward the center of the room once more, not drawn by attention but by purpose, her presence now unmistakably aligned with something larger than the evening itself. Conversations followed her not with noise but with gravity, the kind that acknowledged authority without needing to name it. A senior board member approached with a measured pace, his earlier confidence replaced with a deliberate respect. "There are already calls coming in," he said quietly. "Partners want to know how soon leadership will transition." Emily listened without interruption, her gaze steady, absorbing not just the words but the implications beneath them. "They will be informed in the morning," she replied, her tone calm, decisive, leaving no room for speculation, because she understood something they were only beginning to grasp. Timing was not just strategy, it was control. Alexander stood beside her, his posture unchanged, observing not the room but the way it responded to her, the subtle shifts, the recalibrated alliances, the silent acknowledgments that placed her at the center without needing to declare it. "You could address them now," he said quietly, offering possibility without pressure. Emily's eyes moved briefly across the crowd, taking in the faces, the expectations, the questions forming behind composed expressions. "No," she answered, her voice even. "They do not need reassurance tonight. They need clarity tomorrow." The distinction was precise, intentional, because she was not here to react, she was here to lead. Across the room Ryan remained where he stood, but the space around him had changed, no longer filled with admiration or anticipation, but with distance, a quiet withdrawal of attention that felt more final than any confrontation could have. He watched her with a stillness that no longer held resistance, only recognition, the slow unfolding of a truth he could not reshape. Sophia had stepped back now, her presence no longer anchored beside him. Her earlier certainty dissolved into something uncertain, something searching, as though she was trying to understand where She now stood in a story that had moved beyond her. Emily did not look back. She did not need to, because the past had already released its hold, not through force but through irrelevance. A soft chime echoed briefly as the event coordinator attempted to regain order, but the sound faded quickly, absorbed by a room that no longer followed its original script. Instead it followed her, not with obedience but with alignment, a natural shift toward where direction now existed. Emily paused near the grand staircase, the sweeping architecture framing her in quiet symmetry, not as a display but as a reflection of what had already been established. One of the guests approached cautiously, his voice respectful. "Miss Carter, will you be making a statement?" The question lingered not just for him but for everyone listening. Waiting, Emily met his gaze briefly, her expression composed, grounded. "No," she said simply, and the word carried more weight than any speech could have. Because it was not refusal, it was certainty. She did not need to explain what had already been understood. She did not need to confirm what had already been seen. And as she turned slightly, her gaze lifting toward the exit where the night stretched beyond the glass doors, something final settled into place. Not as an ending but as a transition, because everything that needed to be proven had already been revealed, and everything that followed would no longer be about the past, but about the future she had already stepped into without asking for permission. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened quietly, almost unnoticed at first, but the movement drew Emily's attention with a subtle pull, not urgency, not curiosity, but recognition of what came next. She did not hesitate, did not look back. She simply began to walk toward the exit, each step steady, unhurried, as though the entire evening had been leading to this exact moment. The soft echo of her heels against the polished floor carried farther than expected, not loud but distinct, enough to cut through the lingering conversations. Alexander followed half a step behind, not guiding, not leading, but aligned in a way that spoke of partnership rather than intervention. As they moved, the room responded in quiet shifts, guests parting slightly to allow space, conversations lowering, attention redirecting not out of obligation but instinct, because something about the way she walked made it clear she was not leaving something behind. She was moving forward into something already hers. Ryan watched from across the room, his posture no longer rigid but still, almost anchored to the spot where everything had changed. He did not call out again, did not attempt to stop her, because even he understood now that there was nothing left to interrupt, nothing left to reclaim. The distance between them no longer something that could be crossed with words. Sophia stood a few steps behind him, her expression unreadable, caught somewhere between disbelief and quiet realization, as if she was only now beginning to understand that the story she believed she had stepped into had never truly been about her at all. Emily reached the threshold and paused briefly, not out of hesitation but awareness, the cool air from outside brushing lightly against her face, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city, steady, constant, unchanged by what had just unfolded inside. She glanced once toward the glass doors, her reflection faint but clear enough to see the difference, not in how she looked, but in how she stood, grounded, certain, no longer shaped by the expectations that had once confined her. Alexander stepped beside her then, his presence quiet but unmistakable. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low, not questioning her strength but acknowledging the transition. Emily allowed a small breath to escape, not from relief but from completion. "I have been ready," she replied, her tone calm, carrying a quiet finality that left no room for doubt. Behind them the ballroom remained filled, the lights still warm, the guests still gathered, but it no longer held the same weight, no longer defined the moment, because what mattered had already shifted beyond its walls. She stepped forward, crossing the threshold without looking back, the night opening in front of her like something vast and unwritten, not uncertain but full of direction, the kind that did not need to be announced to exist. As the doors closed softly behind them, the sound barely audible, something else settled into place, not for the room, not for the people still inside, but for her, a quiet understanding that what had once been her past no longer had any claim on her present. And as she moved into the city lights with the same steady confidence, one truth remained clear: she had not left the night behind. She had simply outgrown it. The city outside did not pause for her transformation. It moved with the same steady rhythm, headlights gliding across wet pavement, distant horns blending into the low hum of a life that continued regardless of what had just unfolded. But for Emily, everything felt different. Not louder, not brighter, just clearer, as if the air itself had shifted to make space for something long overdue. She stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool night pressing lightly against her skin, grounding her in the present, not the past she had just walked away from. A sleek black car waited at the curb, its engine running quietly, the driver already stepping out to open the door, but she did not move toward it immediately. Instead, she paused, her gaze lifting briefly to the skyline, the towering buildings reflecting scattered lights like fragments of possibility. Alexander stood beside her, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his presence steady but never imposing. "You did not look surprised," he said after a moment, his voice calm, observational. Emily allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not out of pride but out of acknowledgement. "Because I was not," she replied, her tone even, as if the entire evening had simply confirmed what she had already known. He studied her for a second, not questioning her, but understanding her in a way that required no explanation. "Most people would have waited," he said, "kept things quiet until after tonight." Emily shook her head slightly, her gaze returning to the city. "Most people would have needed permission," she answered, her voice soft but unwavering. And in that distinction lay everything that separated who she had been from who she had become. Behind them, through the glass doors, the faint outline of the ballroom remained visible, a distant world now, filled with people still trying to process what had happened, still rearranging their understanding of power, influence, and control, but none of it reached her anymore. None of it had the weight it once carried. Alexander opened the car door then, the quiet gesture not one of necessity, but of acknowledgement, a recognition of the moment rather than a direction. Emily stepped forward this time without pause, sliding into the seat with a composed ease, her movements unhurried, unforced, as if this was not a transition but a continuation. He followed shortly after, the door closing with a soft, final sound that sealed the distance between what was and what had been. As the car pulled away from the curb, the city lights began to blur slightly through the window, not fading, just shifting. Emily rested her hand lightly against the cool glass, watching the reflection of the night move past her, each passing street another layer of separation, not from the people inside the ballroom, but from the version of herself that had once stood there uncertain, unseen, unrecognized. Alexander glanced toward her, his expression thoughtful. "They will come to you now," he said, not as a warning but as a fact. Emily did not look away from the window, her reflection steady, her posture relaxed. "Let them," she replied quietly, the words carrying no urgency, no need to prepare, because she already had. Because everything that mattered had already been decided long before anyone else realized it. The car turned onto a wider avenue, the skyline opening further ahead, and in that expanding view something settled into place. Not a sense of victory, not satisfaction, but alignment. The quiet understanding that she had not changed direction tonight. She had revealed it, and as the city unfolded in front of her, one truth remained clear: she was no longer stepping into something new. She was simply continuing exactly where she had always intended to go. The car slowed as it turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city softening into something more distant, more controlled, as if even the world outside understood the need for clarity after everything that had unfolded. The building ahead rose with understated elegance, glass and steel reflecting the night in clean, uninterrupted lines, not designed to impress at first glance, but to endure, the kind of place that did not announce power yet held it effortlessly. The car came to a smooth stop and the driver stepped out once more, opening the door with practiced precision. Emily stepped onto the pavement without hesitation, her heels meeting the ground with a steady, grounded rhythm that mirrored something deeper within her. Not anticipation, not uncertainty, but continuation. Alexander joined her a moment later, his gaze briefly scanning the building before returning to her. "This is where it begins to get louder," he said, not as a warning, but as an observation. Emily glanced up at the structure, her reflection faint in the glass doors ahead. It will only sound loud to the people who are just now hearing it, she replied, her voice calm. Because for her this was not noise, it was alignment. They moved inside together, the lobby quiet, polished, illuminated by soft overhead lighting that cast clean shadows across marble floors. A receptionist looked up, recognition flashing instantly across her face before settling into professional composure. "Miss Carter," she said, rising slightly. "They are already waiting upstairs." Emily gave a small nod, not surprised, not rushed, just acknowledging what had been set in motion long before tonight. The elevator doors opened smoothly, the ascent silent except for the faint hum of machinery beneath their feet. Alexander stood beside her, hands loosely at his sides, his presence steady but never intrusive. "Once you walk in there," he said after a moment, "there is no ambiguity left." Emily's gaze remained forward, focused not on the reflection in the mirrored walls, but on what lay ahead. "There never was," she answered quietly, the distinction subtle but absolute, because clarity had never depended on others recognizing it, only on her stepping fully into it. The doors opened to a private floor where a group of executives waited around a long table, their posture attentive, their expressions composed yet undeniably alert. This was no longer curiosity, no longer speculation. This was recognition. They stood as she entered, not out of obligation but out of understanding. "Miss Carter," one of them said, his tone respectful. "We have reviewed the preliminary framework." Emily moved forward without pause, taking her place at the head of the table as if it had always been hers, not claimed, not given, simply occupied at the right moment. "Then let us finalize it," she said, her voice even, carrying the same quiet authority that had reshaped an entire room only moments before. Documents were passed, screens illuminated. Discussions began not with hesitation but with direction, every word measured, every decision precise. There was no need to assert control because it was already present in the way she listened, the way she responded, the way the room adjusted around her. Alexander remained slightly behind, observing, not intervening, because this was no longer a moment that required introduction. It required execution. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows the city stretched endlessly, lights flickering like distant signals, but inside, everything felt contained, deliberate, moving forward with a clarity that left no space for doubt. And as Emily leaned slightly over the table, reviewing the final details with calm precision, one truth settled fully into place. Tonight had never been about changing her life. It had been about revealing the one she had already built in silence.